All right, folks, we are back and we are looking once again at the 1920s, 1930s culture. This is part two of the video series on this subject. And now we're beginning to look at more specifically, some of the contrasts between modern times and traditional times as people saw them in their minds and as people were trying to kind of battle each other over what they wanted their times to look like. And as we move towards more modern ways of doing things and more modern senses of values and so forth, some people embrace that, and then there are always those people who are more conservative, who see concerns and issues about those modern ways and will resist them. And there's some element of validity to both sides of that argument, and it's a good thing for a country to have conversations about, is to look at, well, what are the ramifications of some of the modern ways of doing business, and are they all things that we believe are in our best interest? So one of the ways in which people try to resist some of the changes that were happening in America in the time period that we're studying was with Prohibition. And Prohibition was, of course, the attempt to eliminate the use of alcohol in America. The Volstead Act was the enforcement act of the 18th Amendment. The 18th Amendment banned alcohol for sale, production, transportation, etc. in America. And this was a way in the eyes of many people to restore public morality. There was real concern about the abuse of alcohol and the use of alcohol, especially in the minds of many people by certain kinds of individuals. They were many of the prohibitionists really focusing in on their presumption that alcohol use was higher amongst immigrants and especially the new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe than alcohol use was among typical Americans and as they saw them. And really, there's no reason to believe that that was the case, but that was the mindset. And it also explains why public demand, as this slide says, was so high for alcohol even after Prohibition, and that is because a lot of people thought that Prohibition was passed and it wasn't really about them. It was about a different kind of people that were causing problems in America. The real lower working class folks and the immigrant classes were the targets in many people's minds of Prohibition. Now, on Prohibition, as I just a moment ago said, the use of alcohol remained in America and demand for it remained relatively high. But while Prohibition is usually perceived as a failure and a failed experiment in American history, it did actually drive the use of alcohol way down. Alcohol use has never climbed in terms of the amount of alcohol consumed per person. It's never climbed as high as it was prior to Prohibition in the United States, and it clearly fell at that time. Yes, people did continue to produce illegal alcohol. People did continue to go to illegal drinking facilities, the so-called speakeasies, or in the Detroit area, they were often called blind pigs. At least it seems to me, because the name is drawn from the notion that the police couldn't see them. Alcohol was brought into the country across the river into Detroit from Canada, where it was still produced legally. And this led to bootlegging, as it was called. The term originally came from people who would literally have bottles of alcohol tucked in their boots or into pockets sewn on the insides of their pants or in the insides of their skirts, where they could sell alcohol from inside their clothing that way. And so bootleggers continued to sell alcohol, and this then led to the growth of a significant organized crime racket in the United States of America. In every major city, there were various sorts of illegal syndicates, as they were often called. Al Capone becoming one of the most famous from the era, but they were prominent in every city. The Purple Gang in Detroit, and so forth. And this becomes a serious problem. And I think one of the reasons that people look back on Prohibition as a failure is not so much because it didn't cause alcohol to go down, because it did. Alcohol use went down. The reality is, however, that it caused a certain loss of respect for laws. that young people saw their elders sneaking drinks, and that they knew the speakeasies were there and the police couldn't keep up with it. And they saw people bringing their boats across the river, and they knew that they had alcohol in the back of it. They saw people driving across the Detroit River in the winter months and bringing alcohol back from Canada. And they knew this was going on, and it caused sort of an undermining of Americans' respect for law and order and respect for their institutions of law, the corruption that was going on that was associated with the organized crime rings. All of this, I think, is one of the major reasons that Prohibition has come to us in our mindset as being something of a failure. Why Prohibition? Well, part of it was driven by a notion of religious fundamentalism. And this religious fundamentalism, it paralleled the political nativism or the anti-immigrant mentality that existed. We'll come to that a little bit more in our text readings. But fundamentalist Americans were those individuals that really looked to the Bible and they interpreted it literally. So these are people that are going to believe, for example, the earth was created in precisely 7 days. They reject evolution. They hold to traditional value systems about gender relationships. They hold some really strict attitudes about what is moral and what is not moral. So one of the areas where this became a real battleground was in the teaching of evolution, that theory of evolution, Charles Darwin. It's finding its way into the science classes in schools. 5 states banned the teaching of evolution in public schools. Tennessee was one of them. And there was a trial of a John Scopes in Tennessee. It becomes the celebrated Scopes monkey trial. It's often known that way. William Jennings Bryan, the one-time populist, but also a religious fundamentalist, participated in the prosecution of Scopes. Clarence Darrow, the famous criminal defense attorney, participates in the defense. They square off in this trial in Dayton, Tennessee. It becomes a big circus. People bring monkeys to town, trained monkeys walking around on leashes. People were preaching, standing on boxes on street corners. Signs everywhere said, read your Bible, instead of reading Charles Darwin. And, this issue of fundamentalism, while Scopes lost the trial in Tennessee, he later won on appeal. But the issue it's really never been fully resolved in America. We still have some tension between religious fundamentalism and science and modern science, particularly, and evolution is still there. We also see it in the issues of debate around climate change in America today. So we have these continuing tensions that exist between fundamentalism and science that were found in the 1920s and have not gone away. Mentioned nativism a moment ago, and one of the areas where Americans also tried to sort of conserve a past, that's the conservative impulse, was their restrictions on immigration. So there was some movement to try to restrict the Southern and Eastern Europeans coming to America. They seemed different. Their languages were very different. They were racially sometimes different, especially there were a lot of Jews that came from Eastern Europe. Religiously, they were often different, a lot more Catholics as well as the Jews coming in from both Southern and Eastern Europe. So people were motivated by their senses of racial inferiority, that they believed in America the Jews were inferior, as Americans often believed African Americans were inferior. This racial attitude inspired immigration restrictions, and also wartime patriotism. There were concerns about the people of Eastern Europe that grew out of World War I, especially their radicalism, movement towards communism, and that plays directly into the Red Scare. And just a general sentiment in America amongst a lot of these sort of white Americans that they should preserve America for what they considered to be Native Americans. And that is the people largely of British descent or certainly Western European descent who came and settled this country in its earliest years. And the Southern Europeans, the Eastern Europeans, the Asians, the people from Latin America, are all considered a threat to that. So legislation is passed to set quotas on annual immigration. Those quotas favored people coming to the United States from Western Europe, and they worked against people who would come to the United States from Southern and Eastern Europe. And Asian immigration was virtually cut off in 1924 by the National Origins Act. So there was a race motivation behind it. There was certain displaced sense of patriotism behind it. There was concern about communism and other radicals behind it. And nativism and immigration restrictions become a way of doing business in America in the 1920s. Flowing from this was the revival of the KKK. It's really reborn in 1915. Hiram Evans gets this movement going again. The KKK had first arisen post-Civil War. They dressed in the sheets and the hoods, and they were supposed to represent the ghost of the Confederate dead, and their effort was to try to stop the movement forward of African Americans in terms of gathering rights to themselves post-Civil War. The institution largely drifts away, very small pockets of it left, if any left at all in some states. But there's a movie based on a book called The Klansman, and the movie by D.W. Griffith called The Birth of a Nation. It's a silent movie. It's long, but it was very popular. It told, in the eyes of people at that time, a compelling story. It purported to show how the Republican governments that came south after the Civil War, and in particular African Americans that worked in those Republican governments, were a threat to the way of life of the South. And at the end of the movie, the Klan comes riding in on horseback, and the Klan is the hero of that movie. And it received a lot of popular acclaim. No smaller man than Woodrow Wilson praised the movie. He said it was like writing history with lightning. And it was certainly rewriting history with lightning, but it was not really writing an accurate history. The Klan revives, but it revives itself not just by becoming an anti-African American organization, but they also begin to talk about 100% Americanism. So they go after Catholics, they go after Jews, they go after any other minority racial group. They go after immigrants who are coming in and bringing new ways. And they grow very dramatically. They claim about 3 million members. They become a powerful force in not just the South, but many Western and Midwestern states. And they grow so dramatically. They had a massive rally in Washington, D.C. with tens of thousands of participants, of people marching in the robes and in the hoods down Pennsylvania Avenue, which is the road that connects the White House and the U.S. Capitol building. They were very popular in the early 1920s. The later 20s, they begin to suffer from some scandals. There's various kinds of misbehavior by Klan leaders, but in particular, a leader who was very, very powerful in the politics of the state of Indiana. The head of the Klan, D.C. Stevenson, and he got caught up in a sex scandal for raping a woman who later died after she poisoned herself. But he was convicted and sent to jail for his role in her death. And this brought some discrediting to the Klan, but the Klan did not disappear this time. And they have continued to have a presence in American life, unfortunately, all the way to the present day. So here you see a picture. And if you look over here, you see a picture, and it talks about this being in Indiana. Okay, it says Muncie, Indiana here. So these are women that had joined the Klan. They had a separate women's organization that had a lot of members as well, was widely popular. And they claimed, both the male version of the Klan and the women's version of the Klan, to be representing traditional religious values of America. They appropriated themselves to religious fundamentalism in this country. They would often announce their presence in a town as they formed a new Klan organization by coming in with a prearranged agreement of the minister of the church. They would march into the church once a service had begun on a Sunday morning. They would march up the aisle, all dressed in their robes and often in their hoods, make a donation to the church, perhaps sing a hymn, and then parade out. And that was a way that the Klan would announce its presence. So they, the Klan, that is, picked up on the religious fundamentalism of the era and tried to make themselves attractive to religious fundamentalists. Now, by no stretch, then or today, would religious fundamentalists all be inclined to believe in the racist ideologies of the Klan. But there was a significant overlap, and this was an area where the Klan was able to draw some strength. In opposition to this, but something that did help to spur Klan growth, was the notion of the new Negro and the Harlem Renaissance. Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and others began to write and produce plays and to really emphasize African culture. Now, this grows out of the Great Migration, and a lot of African Americans had moved north. They settle in Harlem. It becomes a major African American cultural center, and these artists explored all kinds of new ways of life for themselves as African Americans living in America. But a large part of what they also did was they looked back with a great deal of pride to Africa and to the cultural history that they had. There were some that took it in a more political way. Marcus Garvey, with his Negro Improvement Association, was one of them, talked Black Pride, really a predecessor in some ways to the Nation of Islam, that later the Black Muslim movement, and a famous leader of that movement, Malcolm X, his father was a follower of Marcus Garvey. And Garvey tried to preach the unity amongst all people of African descent. He also started a bit of a Back to Africa movement, trying to encourage a lot of people to move back, African Americans, that is, to move back to Africa, where they could, be fully themselves again. But there was this very vibrant movement, even though most of the Harlem residents didn't have a lot of money, didn't really have a lot of success for themselves. They were working often at very low-level jobs and not getting a lot of money. But they were nonetheless able to have this cultural center, and it was a moment, a bright, shining moment, really, in African American history, and something to which, even to this day, a lot of African Americans look back in the history of African Americans in this country and feel a great deal of pride because of the literary, the artistic contributions of the people of this era, coming out of Harlem, but also in other places in America. Now, that's mostly 20s stuff, but very closely related to it would be some of the cultural movements of the Great Depression era. And it was also profoundly impacted by some of the same sorts of things, radios and movies primarily. But you do start to get a little bit more of a radical voice found in the 1930s because the economy was so bad. People were often more inclined to be a little more radical when times are really rough. The New Deal helped to encourage the arts. The New Deal, the Works Progress Administration, pushed forward the arts as a way of employing people, which then they would have money in their pockets and go on out and spend that money. So it was an integrated part of the New Deal. Just like the Civilian Conservation Corps was providing jobs for young men to go and build parks, the Works Progress Administration and the Federal Writers Project and others were providing jobs for artists. They were painting murals in bus stations and train stations. Dorothea Lange was out taking photographs all across America, like the famous photograph of Migrant Mother that we saw in class. And all of these projects, they helped to tell the story of the Great Depression. They told the story of American life. They even employed historians who went out and interviewed those slaves that were still alive in America in the 1930s. Most of them had been quite young, of course, when they were living under slavery before the Civil War was ended. But there are interviews that exist, audio recordings, and they're still something that a historian can listen to, that helps to tell the story of African Americans. So the New Deal, in its own way, promoted the arts by paying the artists to continue to produce even though times were bad. Movies, quite an escape for this period of time. The way movies worked back then is you, for a nickel or a dime, you could go in and watch the movies, and you just walked in whenever you paid. And they didn't have start times and stop times, and you would go in and sit down, and the movie might be in the middle, it might be at the beginning, but wherever it was, you'd start watching, and you could stay as long as you wished. And there were movies, there were cartoons, there were newsreels that you could see. Then, of course, they didn't have television news then, so if you wanted to see the news as it was filmed, you could see it then. And Hollywood really at this time, for the most part, is avoiding any really controversial issues, and instead, it's a diversion. It's a way for people to feel better about their lives. So they had gangster movies. That was the form of thriller movie of its day. A lot of comedies, the Charlie Chaplin comedies, and the people with that were always falling down and getting nearly run over by cars or by trains, and all of these things they would call them screwball comedies, or whatever you might want to call them, and they were very physical comedies. Walt Disney cartoons come around during this period of time, and they have a sort of a nice moral vision to them, just as Walt Disney tends to do today. And then you get the beginnings of some of the Frank Capra movies, where you've got this sort of idealized image of small town traditional values, very comforting for people of that era. And so the films were quite an escape for people. And as I mentioned earlier, by the end of the 1930s, about 9 out of 10 Americans had a radio. Radios had a lot of comedy. In the vaudeville sort. Well, today, we have Saturday Night Live and other sketch comedy programs. Vaudeville was a little bit like that, but it relied more just on the sound of it on the radio. Of course, they didn't have the visual images. Also, soap operas. They're called soap operas because they were dramas that targeted women primarily, who were at home listening to the radio during the day. And the most prominent advertisers for those programs were soap companies, whether it be laundry soap or dish soap, whatever kind of soap it might be. And they were called soap operas, and the name stuck. And radio's also become a major way for Americans to get their news about what's going on in the Great Depression. And then, of course, later in the 30s, what's going on with the war that's developing in Europe. So news on the radio becomes a main manner in which Americans are going to find out about what's going on in the world. Of course, also on the radio, and then on the recorded LPs that we talked about earlier, you get jazz music being popularized. A particular kind of music of that era was called swing, a very danceable form of music, and it promoted dancing all across the country. One of the other diversions of the Great Depression era was it's called marathon dancing, where people would compete with each other to see how long they could dance nonstop, and people would fall asleep on their feet, and it became pretty high drama to watch to see who might win some of these dance marathons. But the music of the era was swing music. Benny Goodman, he was a white artist, but also many African-American artists popularized this swing music. Later, it will become Duke Ellington. And this danceable, popular sort of form of music, of jazz music, becomes a major way of life in the 1920s and 30s, in particular in the 30s, with swing music. And it becomes another diversion because swing music, it feels good. And Americans in the 1930s, in the Great Depression era, whether it was the movies, the radios, or the music, looking for things that made them feel better about their lives because their lives were in really bad shape. So that is the end of our look at the culture of the 1920s and 30s. And I hope that you have found the videos helpful in adding to what we were able to discuss in class.